Clear fire. Two magazines. Nice job. Thank you.
First, man. Thank you.
Events firing. Put your left hand there.
You want to be real fluid. There you go.
I don't want it now, but I want to put it up there for the crank.
Okay, you've been watching some Civil War reenactors fire what's called the Gatling gun, and that's what I want to talk to you about, is the Gatling gun. Now, several years ago, I read this book here, Mr. Gatling's Terrible Marvel, and it provided me with a lot of information such that if you understand Mr. Gatling's invention, then you'll understand that basically the Civil War was a complete hoax. So there's a diagram for you, a picture of the Gatling gun, and basically it was hand cranked, as you have seen, with the barrels rotating, and could fire up to 200 rounds per minute during its initial invention time period. Later, that amount of rounds will increase tremendously. So this invention by Mr. Gatling is really done and perfected by about 1858. Now, a lot of articles you'll read will say that he perfected it during, quote, the Civil War. No, that's inaccurate. It was done, it was ready, it was perfected a few years just before the so-called start of the Civil War in 1861. So this weapon was actually in the hands of the North. Mr. Gatling was originally from the South, a little town called Murfreesboro, North Carolina, Hertford County. Even though he had Southern roots, somehow the gun ended up north, which created a little suspicion about Mr. Gatling and his so-called allegiance. But this weapon is ready to go. It's ready to go. And it could have been in the hands of every Union commanding officer. Now there's a little more of an authentic type photo to look at. So this invention could have been in the hands of every commanding officer up north. Which means that if the war was real, and if there was a real confrontation between the South and the North, there would have been absolutely no possibility of there being any type of war existing. Because in a matter of 5 minutes, this deadly machine would have wiped out anything of the South. Because the South was very poor in terms of arms and equipment. All industry was primarily located in the North. So you have a handful of Southerners with just basic equipment, barely can fire their rifles, and they're confronted by a Northern army that has this, 200 rounds per minute. What that means is it would have been an absolute massive slaughter if it were, quote, real. Now, once again, one of my videos is called Real, R-E-A-L, or R-E-E-L. In the minds of the American people, the Civil War was real in the R-E-E-L. Through photographs, through stories in newspapers. Which means the reality of the situation would have been that every commanding officer in the North could have had this tremendous invention. Which this gun was the forerunner of the modern gas-propelled machine gun that will be used, or is said to be used, in World War I. In other words, it was a monster. It was so incredible, and it was so devastating that if there ever was, quote, a real battle, R-E-A-L, this piece of equipment would have ended the matter in probably one day. What man from the South would want to face this with just a little tiny rifle? Do you see the logic of what I'm trying to get out to you? Okay? So now we're going to go to some other images. And there's Mr. Richard Gatling. Like I said, he's originally from the South. And he will go north up to Indianapolis, I believe, and begin his Gatling company. And the Gatling company will manufacture these Gatling guns until about 1870, I believe. He sells it out to Colt Manufacturing. Keep in mind that his work and the work of his company will provide the basis for the modern machine gun. Okay? Now, supposedly in our history, what we're given, that he was a little bit mistrusted up north because his original roots are from the South. Hey, he looks a little like Grant. He might actually have played the role of Grant. Okay, there's the machine. All right, now, what's going to happen is that if you read history books, they will say something like, oh, the Northern generals didn't want this because other machines of a similar nature were always failing. Well, it's all BS. If you were a commanding officer and you were going up against real battles in real war, would you not want to be able to win within a matter of minutes? So a lot of what you see in articles online and everything, they don't really get it quite right. Some of them will tell you he was developing this during the Civil War. No. It was done and perfected probably by 1858. So the Gatling gun will remain a little bit silent for a while after Civil War, and eventually will get into the hands of the British, and they will use it in their campaigns, in their colonial efforts to take over control of Africa. and they will have it available to them. So let's talk a little bit about the Gatling gun on Americans. Now, in New York City, in 1863, I believe, we are told there were riots. Now, once again, a lot of what we're told as history is given to us as stories. So I'm only trying to take what I know based on what the stories are that are handed to us. But if you follow the storyline is that there were riots up in New York City because people were upset with Mr. Lincoln's so-called war, and they didn't like the draft, and they're called the draft riots. Now, the interesting thing there is that in these draft riots, the folks who are in charge are looking for a way to squelch them, control them. And in the book that I showed you that I read, what they did was they brought some Gatling guns out, put them on the rooftops, and demonstrated them to the rioters. And right after the guns were demonstrated, the riots ceased. Okay, I'm just trying to hand to you the stories that you read. How much truth is in them, I don't know. But the fact remains that the Gatling gun existed, and if it was used in this fashion on the American people who were dissatisfied with the whole idea of a war, and especially a war against their own, namely the South. Now, having grown up in the American educational system, and particularly in the system in the North, you're never told anything at all about something like this, that people actually were upset with Mr. Lincoln and his war, the so-called great president. I guess he's been voted as maybe the greatest president of all time. But you'll never hear this kind of stuff mentioned in the educational system, because the educational system just wants to present things as an open shut case, namely that the North was completely righteous, and any attempts for these southern states to, quote, leave the Union was terrible, even though the Articles of Confederation said that if anyone wanted to leave, that was fine and dandy. So Mr. Gatling's gun is modeled and demonstrated for the rioters in New York City, and the riots stopped. Interesting. So maybe nobody was actually hurt or killed, but the one fact remains: the gun shut them up. And Mr. Gatling and his invention will change history. Now, there's another side to this, is a lot of times there's one individual that gets the credit, but really and truly, behind the scenes, behind the curtain, there's an incredible maybe research team doing things. And you see this like in the music industry. You get a big figure in the music industry, like a John Lennon or like a Michael Jackson. And you say, wow, they're really musically sharp. Not really, they're just a puppet. There's a whole team of folks working to develop things like the Gatling gun or like music that John Lennon presented to the world. And you don't know about them. You have no idea. So it's not really maybe that Mr. Gatling invented it, but Mr. Gatling was the front. He was the man that got the credit. And that's the way it is with technology. And this here group, whoever they might be in whatever category you select, are probably 25 years or so ahead of us in many, many things. So maybe this group got together and they actually came up with a Gatling gun, and they needed someone to spearhead it, and of course it would have been Richard Gatling, and maybe he never really invented it, but behind the scenes there was an incredible workforce that invented this gun. So anyhow, you've listened to me kind of go on and on here, and I want to thank you for watching this video. Again, the Gatling gun proves that there was no, quote, Civil War. Why would anyone want to stand up to a gun that fires 200 rounds per minute in a day and age when you just have single shot or maybe a repeating rifle, and that's it. So the Gatling gun, in my estimation, proves nobody died, nobody got hurt in the Civil War.